The train whistle cut through the Wisconsin morning, like a blade through silence, announcing another delivery to Camp McCoy. Lieutenant James Morrison pressed his face against the cattle car's wooden slats, watching snow-dusted farmland roll past in the pale March light. 3 months since his capture at Iwo Jima, and still the sight of American soil made his chest tighten with shame that felt heavier than his chains. The car lurched to a stop beside a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by barbed wire. Through gaps in the planking, Morrison glimpsed something that made no sense. A guard sharing a cigarette with another prisoner, both men laughing at some private joke. In the Pacific, they'd been taught that capture meant torture, starvation, death. But the guard looked well-fed, almost bored, like a factory worker on break. "Everybody out! Keep your hands visible!" The doors slid open with a metallic screech. Morrison stumbled into the Wisconsin cold, his legs unsteady after days of confinement. Around him, 24 Japanese prisoners blinked in the sudden brightness, their faces masks of stoic resignation. They'd prepared for brutality, for the barbaric treatment their officers had promised awaited anyone foolish enough to survive capture. Instead, they found Sergeant Bill Harper, a tired-looking American in his 30s, who chewed tobacco and spoke broken Japanese with a thick Midwestern accent. "Welcome to Camp McCoy. You follow rules, we get along fine. You cause trouble, you sit in isolation eating bread and water. Simple as that." Morrison understood enough English to catch the casual tone, so different from the screaming fury they'd expected. But it was Staff Sergeant Tanaka, the ranking prisoner, who truly unsettled him. As they were led through processing, Tanaka whispered the same question that had haunted Morrison for weeks. "How do we face our families if we return having been treated better by enemies than by our own officers?" The smell hit them as they approached the mess hall, rich, meaty aromas that made Morrison's stomach clench with hunger and confusion. Through the windows, he glimpsed American soldiers eating what looked like thick sandwiches, drinking from glass bottles that caught the light like amber jewels. The abundance seemed obscene after years of rationed rice and seaweed soup. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the camp's medical officer, intercepted their group at the barracks entrance. A Chinese-American woman in her 40s, she moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to examining bodies that told stories their owners couldn't voice. "Any injuries? Illness? Don't be proud. Infection doesn't care about honor." Her directness startled Morrison. In the Imperial Army, medical officers maintained rigid hierarchy, never addressing enlisted men with such equality. When she handed him a clean blanket, her fingers briefly touched his wrist, checking his pulse, he realized later, but in that moment it felt like simple human contact. That evening, lying on a real mattress for the first time in months, Morrison stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he'd been taught with what he'd witnessed. The guards had fed them beef stew and bread with butter. Sergeant Harper had even offered him something called Coca-Cola from a curved glass bottle, though Morrison had declined, uncertain whether accepting would constitute collaboration. But it was 8-year-old Tommy Kowalski who delivered the blow that would crack Morrison's certainty. The local farmer's son had pressed against the fence during evening recreation, watching the prisoners with wide blue eyes. When Morrison approached, the boy held up a half-eaten hamburger, thick beef patty, cheese melting over the edges, fresh lettuce bright as spring grass. "You hungry, mister? My mom packed extra." The innocence in those words struck Morrison like a physical blow. This child saw him not as a monster or enemy, but simply as someone who might be hungry. The hamburger represented everything Morrison had been taught to hate about American excess, yet the boy's gesture carried a purity that made Morrison's throat burn with unshed tears. Tanaka appeared beside him, jaw rigid with disapproval. "Propaganda. They fatten us to make us grateful. A true soldier would rather starve than accept enemy charity." But that night, Morrison dreamed not of battle or shame, but of his mother's hands preparing rice balls for his lunchbox. the same careful attention to feeding someone she loved. When he woke, the parallel felt like betrayal and revelation in equal measure. If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. The routine at Camp McCoy followed rhythms Morrison had never imagined in a prison. Morning roll call at dawn, work details that actually served useful purposes, meals that arrived on schedule with portions that satisfied rather than merely sustained. By his second week, Morrison found himself assigned to the camp kitchen, where he worked alongside Corporal Jake Brennan, a farm boy from Minnesota who treated cooking like a sacred duty. "Secret to a good hamburger is the fat content," Brennan explained one afternoon, forming patties with practiced hands. "Too lean and it dries out, too fatty and it falls apart. Balance, you know." Morrison watched the American's careful technique, the way he seasoned each patty with salt and pepper, then arranged them on the grill with mathematical precision. The sizzling meat filled the kitchen with aromas that made Morrison's mouth water despite himself. When Brennan offered him a taste, just a small piece on a fork, Morrison found himself accepting before he could think. The flavor exploded across his palate, rich, savory, complex in ways that Japanese military rations had never achieved. It wasn't just food, it was comfort, abundance, the taste of a nation that had never known true hunger. Morrison chewed slowly, understanding for the first time what the Americans were defending. "Good, right?" Brennan grinned. "My dad raises cattle back home. Always said the best way to know a man's character is to see how he treats his animals and cooks his food." That afternoon brought Morrison's first real conversation with Dr. Chen. She'd called him to the infirmary after noticing his persistent cough, a lingering effect from the damp conditions at his previous holding facility. "How long have you had this?" she asked, listening to his chest with practiced efficiency. 3 weeks, maybe 4. "And the other prisoners? Any similar symptoms?" Morrison hesitated. Military protocol dictated minimal cooperation with captors, but Dr. Chen's genuine concern made deception feel petty rather than patriotic. When he mentioned Tanaka's increasing fatigue, she immediately requested to examine the sergeant as well. It was while waiting for Tanaka that Morrison noticed the photograph on Dr. Chen's desk. A young man in American uniform, smiling beneath a Pacific sun. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "My nephew," she said quietly, following his gaze, "shot down over the Philippines last year. We still don't know if he survived the crash." The revelation hung between them like smoke from incense. Here was the enemy, tending his health while mourning her own family's sacrifice. Morrison felt the foundation of his certainties shifting like sand beneath incoming tide. Tanaka emerged from the examination room with barely controlled fury. "She wants to give us medicine, American medicine, as if we're charity cases instead of prisoners of war." "Maybe we are charity cases," Morrison found himself saying. "Maybe that's not shameful." Tanaka's eyes narrowed. "You're forgetting yourself, Morrison-kun, and forgetting your duty to the Emperor." But that evening, Morrison watched Brennan prepare hamburgers for the camp staff's dinner, noting how the corporal saved the choicest cuts for Dr. Chen, how he arranged pickles and tomatoes with the care of an artist. When one of the guards complained about the onions being too thick, Brennan simply nodded and adjusted his technique without argument or resentment. The small exchange revealed something Morrison hadn't expected. Hierarchy here operated on competence and mutual respect rather than rigid authority. Brennan took pride in his work because it mattered, because feeding people well was its own form of honor. Later, lying in his bunk, Morrison tried to write a letter to his mother, one that would never be sent, but helped him process the contradictions gnawing at his conscience. "Dear Mother," he wrote in careful characters, "today I learned that the enemy makes hamburgers with the same attention you give to rice balls. I do not know what this means for the war or for my own soul, but I thought you should know that kindness exists even here, and that troubles me more than cruelty would." But through the barracks window, he could see the lights of Sparta, Wisconsin, twinkling in the distance like earthbound stars. Somewhere in that town, families were sitting down to dinner, sharing the day's small victories and defeats. The normalcy of it felt like a revelation wrapped in accusation. Tommy Kowalski returned the next afternoon, this time bringing his little sister, Mary. They pressed against the fence during recreation hour, watching the prisoners with the frank curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to hate. When Tommy offered Morrison another hamburger through the wire, the boy's sister added her own contribution, a bottle of Coca-Cola, still cold from their family's icebox. "My daddy says you're from Japan," Mary announced with 6-year-old directness. "That's really far away. Do you miss home?" Morrison accepted the Coca-Cola with hands that trembled slightly. The first sip sent bubbles dancing across his tongue, sweet, sharp, utterly foreign yet somehow refreshing. It tasted like celebration, like the kind of simple pleasure his homeland had forgotten in its pursuit of empire and glory. "Yes," he managed in broken English. "I miss home very much." Tommy nodded sagely. "That's okay. Being sad is normal when you're far from your family." Standing there at the fence, sharing a hamburger and Coca-Cola with enemy children, while Tanaka watched with undisguised horror, Morrison felt the last of his certainties crumble like castle walls before artillery. These weren't the monsters from propaganda posters. They were simply people, capable of both kindness and cruelty, living their lives with the same hopes and fears that motivated everyone. And that recognition, Morrison realized, might be the most dangerous truth a prisoner could carry. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, delivered with a batch of Red Cross mail that sent ripples of desperate hope through Camp McCoy's prisoner barracks. Morrison recognized his mother's careful handwriting immediately, though the paper felt thin and cheap, a sign of rationing that made his stomach clench with worry. "My dearest James," she wrote, "we received word of your capture through official channels, and while we grieve that you could not die with honor, we are grateful you still live. Food grows scarcer each week. Little Hiroshi from next door died in the latest air raid on Tokyo. The Americans bomb our schools and hospitals without mercy, proving their barbaric nature. We pray you resist their torture with the strength your father showed in the last war. Do not let them break your spirit with false kindness." Morrison read the letter 3 times before the full weight of its contradiction settled over him like a shroud. His family believed him to be enduring torture while he'd just spent the morning helping Corporal Brennan perfect a new hamburger recipe. They spoke of American barbarity while Dr. Chen continued treating his cough with medicines more advanced than anything available in Japan. Sergeant Tanaka, reading his own family correspondence nearby, looked up with hollow eyes. "My wife writes that our son asked when Papa would come home to die properly for the Emperor. She had to explain that Papa was captured alive, bringing shame to our family name." The words hung in the spring air like smoke from burning cities. Around them, other prisoners sat in similar silence, each processing letters that portrayed their captivity as a fate worse than death, while they lived with fuller bellies and warmer beds than they'd known in months. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Catherine Hoffman, a Red Cross inspector from Madison, who arrived to document camp conditions according to Geneva Convention requirements. Morrison watched from his work detail as she toured the facilities with crisp efficiency, her trained eyes cataloguing everything from food quality to medical care standards. During her interview with prisoners, Mrs. Hoffman addressed Morrison directly through a Japanese interpreter. "Have you been treated according to international law? Are you receiving adequate food, medical attention, and opportunities for recreation?" The honest answer should have been yes. The hamburgers were rich and satisfying, the Coca-Cola a luxury he'd never tasted before capture. Dr. Chen's medical care exceeded anything he'd received in the Imperial Army. Even the guards treated prisoners with professional distance rather than personal hatred, but Tanaka's eyes burned with warning from across the room. Behind Mrs. Hoffman stood Captain Reynolds, the camp commander, whose fate might depend on prisoner testimony. And beneath it all lay the poisonous question: what kind of soldier reports that his enemies treated him better than his own commanders ever had? "We are treated according to regulations," Morrison answered carefully. "No complaints." Mrs. Hoffman made notes in her precise handwriting, unaware that each word Morrison spoke felt like betrayal wrapped in truth. When she asked about the food, he described it as adequate, though the hamburgers Brennan prepared contained more protein than most Japanese civilians saw in a week. When she inquired about recreation, he mentioned the books and games, while omitting how young Tommy Kowalski brought comic books and shared stories about his pet rabbit through the fence. After the inspection, Morrison found himself assigned to kitchen cleanup, working alongside Brennan in the quiet aftermath of dinner service. The corporal seemed unusually subdued, methodically scrubbing grease from the grill where that day's hamburgers had sizzled. "That Red Cross lady ask you hard questions?" Brennan inquired without looking up. Morrison considered lying, then found he couldn't. "Not hard enough, maybe." Brennan paused in his scrubbing. "My uncle was captured in the last war. Spent 2 years in a German camp. When he came home, people asked if the Germans treated him bad. He always said they treated him like regulations required. Nothing more, nothing less, but I could tell there was more to the story." "What kind of more?" "The kind that makes you realize the enemy's just people too. And that's a hell of a thing to carry home when everyone wants to hear about monsters." That evening, Dr. Chen stopped by Morrison's bunk during her medical rounds. His cough had improved dramatically under her treatment, though she continued monitoring his progress with professional thoroughness. "The Red Cross inspector was impressed with our medical facilities," she mentioned while checking his pulse. "She said you spoke fairly about the care you've received here." Morrison met her eyes, seeing again the photograph of her missing nephew on the infirmary desk. "You could have let me stay sick. Some doctors would have, considering the circumstances." "Doctor." Chen's expression softened slightly. "Sickness doesn't have nationality, Morrison. Neither does healing." After she left, Morrison lay in darkness, listening to the soft breathing of sleeping prisoners around him. Through the barracks window, he could see lights in the distant farmhouses, each one representing a family going about their evening routines. Children doing homework, parents planning tomorrow's work, grandparents sharing stories by the radio. These people had sons and brothers fighting in the Pacific, dying on beaches Morrison had helped defend. Yet here they were, feeding and healing their enemies' children with the same care they'd show their own family members. The cognitive dissonance felt like carrying 2 different truths in his chest, each one real, neither one complete. Tanaka's voice emerged from the next bunk, barely above a whisper. "You're changing, Morrison-kun. I can see it in how you look at the guards, how you taste their food. When we return home, will you tell them about the torture and starvation, or about hamburgers and Coca-Cola?" The question struck like artillery finding its range. Morrison understood now why his uncle had always grown quiet during war stories, why veterans sometimes drank alone and stared at nothing. Some truths were too complex for the simple narratives people needed to believe. "I don't know," Morrison admitted. "Maybe that's the worst part of all this, not knowing which story I'm supposed to tell." Outside, Wisconsin winter was finally yielding to spring, but Morrison felt himself entering a season of uncertainty that might never end. The war would eventually finish, borders would be redrawn, and prisoners would return to families expecting heroes or martyrs. But what did you call a man who'd been treated with dignity by the enemy he'd been taught to hate? Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. April brought unseasonable warmth to southern Wisconsin, and with it, changes to Camp McCoy's daily routine that Morrison found both welcome and unsettling. The prisoner work details expanded to include outdoor projects, road maintenance, fence repair, and assistance with the camp's vegetable garden. For the first time in months, Morrison worked under open sky, feeling genuine sunlight warm his shoulders as he helped plant rows of carrots and potatoes. It was during one of these garden details that he experienced what Dr. Chen would later call his turning point, though Morrison himself wouldn't recognize it until much later. He was working alongside Private Danny Walsh, a 19-year-old guard from Milwaukee who treated his duty with the casual friendliness of someone accustomed to thinking the best of people. Walsh had been sharing stories about his girlfriend back home, her letters, their plans to marry after the war, his worries about whether she'd wait for someone who spent his military service watching prisoners rather than fighting enemies. "Thing is," Walsh confided while they transplanted seedlings, "I keep thinking how this could have been me, you know. If I'd been born over there instead of here, might be you wearing the uniform and me behind the wire." The observation hung between them like morning mist, simple and profound. Morrison had been thinking similar thoughts, but lacked the English vocabulary to express such complex ideas. Instead, he pointed to the seedling in Walsh's hands. "Same seeds, different soil," he managed in broken English. Walsh's grin showed he understood perfectly. Exactly. Same seeds, different soil. It was then that Tommy Kowalski appeared at the garden fence, clutching something wrapped in brown paper. The 8-year-old had become a regular visitor during outdoor work details, his childhood curiosity apparently stronger than any adult warnings about fraternizing with enemy prisoners. "My mom made extra," Tommy announced, unwrapping 2 hamburgers still warm from his family's kitchen. "She said, 'Hungry people don't care about politics.'" Morrison accepted the offering with hands that trembled slightly. The hamburger was perfect. Thick beef patty, melted cheese, crisp lettuce, all nestled in a soft bun that tasted like his grandmother's sweetbread. But it was the casual generosity that struck him most forcefully. Mrs. Kowalski had spent her own rationed meat and precious ingredients to feed enemy prisoners, not from any political motive, but simply because feeding people was what decent humans did. Walsh watched Morrison eat with obvious pleasure. "Good, right? Mrs. K makes the best burgers in 3 counties. "Very good," Morrison agreed, though "good" felt inadequate to describe the complex emotions the simple meal evoked. Each bite carried flavors of home and abundance, of a nation that had somehow maintained its humanity despite years of brutal warfare. Tommy produced a bottle of Coca-Cola from his jacket pocket, condensation beading on the green glass like morning dew. "Try this too, it's my favorite." Morrison accepted the bottle and took a careful sip. The sweet, effervescent liquid seemed to capture something essentially American. Optimistic, energetic, unapologetically abundant. It tasted like the opposite of war, like peacetime celebrations and childhood summers that existed only in memory now. "What do you miss most about home?" Tommy asked with the directness that only children possessed. Morrison considered the question seriously. What did he miss? His mother's cooking, certainly, but more than that, the certainty of knowing who he was supposed to be, what he was supposed to believe, how he was supposed to feel about enemies who fed him hamburgers and healed his illnesses. "I miss understanding," he answered finally. Tommy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Understanding's important. My teacher says that's what school is for, helping people understand things." That evening, Dr. Chen made an announcement that would reshape Morrison's final weeks at Camp McCoy. The camp was participating in a new program, allowing select prisoners to assist with medical duties, primarily helping treat other prisoners who struggled with English communication during medical visits. "I'm recommending you for the program, Morrison," she told him after evening medical rounds. "Your English is improving rapidly, and you have a calming presence with the other men." Morrison felt Tanaka's disapproving stare from across the barracks. Assisting the camp's medical officer crossed a line that many prisoners considered collaboration, regardless of the humanitarian benefits. But Morrison found himself accepting before he could overthink the decision. Working in the infirmary over the following days revealed aspects of camp life he hadn't previously understood. Dr. Chen treated guards and prisoners with equal professional attention, never allowing personal feelings to compromise medical judgment. When Private Walsh arrived with a severe case of poison ivy from their garden work, she prescribed the same aggressive treatment she'd use for any patient. More significantly, Morrison witnessed her private struggles with cases that military regulations couldn't solve. Prisoner Yamamoto had developed symptoms of what Dr. Chen quietly diagnosed as severe depression, brought on by letters from his family describing starvation conditions in their bombed-out city. Military protocol offered no treatment for the spiritual wound of surviving while loved ones suffered. Sometimes the hardest part isn't healing bodies, Dr. Chen confided to Morrison while updating medical records. It's watching good people carry guilt they don't deserve. She showed him Yamamoto's file, pointing to weight loss charts and behavioral observations that painted a picture of a man slowly dying from shame rather than physical illness. In Chinese medicine, we have a concept called heart sickness, illness that comes from moral conflict rather than physical causes. Western medicine has fewer tools for healing that kind of pain. Morrison understood exactly what she meant. He'd been experiencing his own version of heart sickness since arriving at Camp McCoy, watching his certainties crumble with each act of unexpected kindness, each conversation that revealed the humanity of supposed enemies. That night, he made a decision that would define the remainder of his captivity, writing in the journal Dr. Chen had given him for recording medical observations. Morrison began documenting not just physical symptoms, but the complete truth of his experience. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola, the kindness of guards, the professionalism of medical care, the innocence of children who saw prisoners as people rather than enemies. He wrote, knowing the journal might someday be read by military authorities, that his words could be interpreted as collaboration or worse, but Dr. Chen's example had shown him that some truths were too important to sacrifice to fear, that bearing witness honestly was its own form of duty. Tanaka discovered the journal 3 days later, reading pages while Morrison worked his medical detail. The confrontation that evening was inevitable. You're documenting their propaganda, Morrison-kun, making their case that we've been treated well when our families suffer under their bombs. I'm documenting what happened, Morrison replied quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. And what do you think will happen when we return home, carrying stories of enemy kindness? Do you think our families will thank us for that knowledge? Morrison had no answer, because Tanaka was right. The truth he was documenting would bring no comfort to grieving families, no validation to a nation that needed to believe its enemies were monsters. But it was still the truth, and abandoning it felt like abandoning something essential about who he wanted to be. The revelation came on a rain-soaked morning in early May, wrapped in the mundane routine of medical supply inventory. Morrison was helping Dr. Chen organize recently arrived pharmaceuticals when he noticed something that made his hands freeze over a bottle of morphine. Japanese characters printed alongside the English label, indicating the medication had been manufactured in a neutral Swiss facility specifically for treating Japanese prisoners of war. Dr. Chen followed his gaze and understood immediately what he'd discovered. You're wondering why we have medicine specifically labeled for Japanese prisoners, she said quietly. Morrison nodded, unable to voice the implications swirling through his mind. If the Americans had invested in specialized medical supplies for enemy prisoners, it suggested a level of long-term planning and humanitarian concern that contradicted everything he'd been taught about Western attitudes toward Japanese lives. "There's something you should know," Dr. Chen continued, glancing toward the infirmary door to ensure their privacy, "about why this camp operates the way it does." She led him to her office and retrieved a folder from a locked desk drawer. Inside were documents Morrison couldn't fully read, but he recognized enough military terminology to understand their significance. Directives from the U.S. War Department outlining specific protocols for treating Japanese prisoners, emphasizing medical care, adequate nutrition, and psychological support. These orders came from the highest levels of command, Dr. Chen explained. Not because American leadership particularly loves Japanese soldiers, but because they're planning for what comes after the war ends. Morrison felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding. After? Your country will need to be rebuilt, Morrison. Its people will need to remember that Americans can be trusted to keep their word, to honor international law even during wartime. Every prisoner who returns home carrying stories of fair treatment becomes an ambassador for that future relationship. She showed him another document, this one bearing official seals that marked it as classified intelligence. Morrison's English wasn't strong enough to pass the complex policy language, but Dr. Chen translated the essential points. American strategists believe Japan will surrender within the year. When that happens, they want Japanese civilians to accept occupation forces rather than fighting to the death. Prisoners who can testify that Americans treated them with dignity will be crucial to that acceptance. The revelation struck Morrison like physical force. His treatment at Camp McCoy hadn't been simple kindness. It had been policy, calculated strategy designed to serve American post-war interests. The hamburgers, the medical care, even young Tommy's innocent offerings had been part of a larger plan to reshape Japanese attitudes toward their conquerors. Morrison sank into the chair beside Dr. Chen's desk, feeling dizzy as his understanding of the past months reorganized itself around this new information. Had Corporal Brennan's cooking lessons been genuine friendship or subtle propaganda? Were Dr. Chen's medical efforts pure humanitarianism or strategic investment in Japan's future compliance? "You're wondering if any of it was real," Dr. Chen said gently. "If the kindness you've experienced was genuine or just another form of warfare." Morrison nodded, not trusting his voice. "Let me show you something else." She retrieved a letter from another folder, this one handwritten in English. Morrison recognized the letterhead. St. Mary's Hospital, Milwaukee. "This is from my nephew's commanding officer, the one I told you about who was shot down over the Philippines. We received word last month that he was captured alive." She translated portions of the letter, her voice steady despite the emotion Morrison could see in her eyes. "He's being held in a prisoner camp near Manila. According to the Red Cross reports, conditions are difficult. Many prisoners are dying from starvation and disease. The Japanese camp administrators apparently don't share American strategic thinking about post-war relationships." Morrison felt his stomach clench with shame. While he'd been eating hamburgers and drinking Coca-Cola, American prisoners in Japanese camps were enduring the kind of systematic brutality he'd expected to face at Camp McCoy. "So why?" he managed to ask. "Why treat us well when your own soldiers—" "Because someone has to break the cycle," Dr. Chen said simply. "Because treating you like animals won't bring my nephew home any faster, and it won't help either of our countries heal after this war ends." She pulled out the photograph of her nephew that Morrison had noticed during his first medical examination, looking at the young man's smiling face with eyes that held both grief and determination. "Every time I treat a prisoner's illness or injury, I imagine someone showing the same care to David. Maybe that's naive, but it's the only way I can do this job without becoming as cruel as the forces that separated families in the first place." Morrison understood then that the strategic calculations were only part of the story. Yes, American policy had directed his humane treatment, but the daily implementation of that policy still required individual choices. Brennan could have served adequate food without sharing cooking techniques or family stories. Dr. Chen could have provided regulation medical care without the personal attention she'd shown each patient. Tommy Kowalski's family could have followed the policy without adding their own hamburgers and bottles of Coca-Cola. The policy explains the framework, Dr. Chen continued, but it doesn't explain Private Walsh teaching you English phrases, or Mrs. Kowalski sending extra food, or Tommy bringing you comic books. Those gestures come from something deeper than strategic planning. That evening, Morrison shared the discovery with Tanaka, watching his fellow sergeant process the same revelations that had shattered Morrison's understanding hours earlier. Tanaka's response was characteristically rigid. It changes nothing. We've still been manipulated, used as pawns in their post-war planning. The kindness was false, calculated to serve their interests rather than ours. But Morrison found himself disagreeing for the first time since their capture. Maybe it was both, he said quietly. Maybe kindness can be strategic and still be real. Maybe people can follow orders and still choose how they follow them. He thought of Dr. Chen treating his cough with medicines specifically procured for Japanese prisoners, but doing so with the same gentle attention she'd show her own family members. He remembered Brennan teaching him hamburger recipes not because any regulation required it, but because sharing knowledge about food was how the young corporal expressed friendship. When we return home, Tanaka continued, will you tell our families about American strategic planning or about the abundance and comfort we experienced while they starved? The question that had haunted Morrison for weeks now carried additional weight. His testimony wouldn't just reflect personal experience. It would potentially serve American interests by reinforcing their narrative of humane treatment and civilized occupation. Yet remaining silent would deny the genuine kindness he'd witnessed, the humanity that had emerged even within the framework of calculated policy. I'll tell them the truth, Morrison said finally. All of it. The strategy and the kindness, the policy and the personal choices. People are intelligent enough to understand complexity. Tanaka's expression suggested he doubted that assumption, but Morrison had reached a point where simple answers no longer satisfied him. The world was more complicated than their military training had suggested, filled with people capable of both calculated manipulation and spontaneous generosity, sometimes simultaneously. That night, Morrison added new entries to his journal, documenting both the strategic framework Dr. Chen had revealed and the individual acts of kindness that had transcended mere policy implementation. Future readers would have to wrestle with the same contradictions he was facing, the uncomfortable truth that enemies could be simultaneously calculating and humane, that survival sometimes required accepting help from those you'd been taught to hate. The rain continued through the night, drumming against the barracks roof like distant artillery. But Morrison found the sound comforting rather than ominous, a reminder that some forces were natural rather than human, that the world contained rhythms older and more fundamental than the conflicts that temporarily divided nations. The war ended on a Tuesday afternoon in August, announced over Camp McCoy's loudspeaker system, with the same matter-of-fact tone used for meal times and work detail assignments. Morrison was helping Dr. Chen organize medical supplies when Captain Reynolds's voice crackled through the static. Attention all personnel. The Empire of Japan has surrendered unconditionally. Hostilities have ceased effective immediately. Around him, Morrison watched American guards and medical staff process the news with expressions ranging from relief to stunned disbelief. Some cheered, others simply stared at nothing, perhaps thinking of brothers and friends who wouldn't be coming home. Dr. Chen sat quietly at her desk, her nephew's photograph held in trembling hands. The first twist came 3 days later, when repatriation orders arrived with an unexpected complication. Due to the devastation in Japan and ongoing occupation logistics, Prisoner returns would be staggered over several months. Morrison and approximately 30 other prisoners would remain at Camp McCoy until November, essentially serving as witnesses to America's post-war transition. Tanaka received the news with bitter satisfaction. Now we see their true strategy: keep us here to observe their abundance and prosperity while our homeland struggles to rebuild. When we finally return, we'll carry stories of American strength that will discourage future resistance. But Morrison found himself less concerned with strategic implications than with the immediate human dynamics surrounding them. Private Walsh had received orders to ship out to the Pacific for occupation duty, and Morrison was surprised by how much he would miss the young guard's casual friendliness. Corporal Brennan was being reassigned to a base in California, but not before teaching Morrison one final hamburger recipe. "For when you get home," Brennan explained, carefully writing down measurements and techniques. "Might be hard to find beef for a while, but when things get better, you can make these for your family." Food's one of the best ways to share good memories. The recipe card felt heavier than paper in Morrison's hands. Brennan had included notes about seasoning variations and cooking temperatures, but also personal observations about why cooking mattered, how sharing meals created connections that transcended cultural differences. It was both a practical gift and a statement of faith that former enemies could maintain some form of friendship. The second twist arrived with the autumn harvest season. Local farmers, facing labor shortages due to returning veterans seeking better employment opportunities, requested permission to hire Camp McCoy prisoners for agricultural work. Morrison found himself spending October mornings picking apples in orchards that stretched toward horizons he'd never expected to see as a free man. Working alongside Tommy Kowalski's father, Pete, Morrison experienced something approaching normalcy for the first time since his capture. Pete treated him as simply another farmhand, paying him the same wages as local workers, and including him in the casual conversations that filled long harvest days. "Tommy talks about you all the time," Pete mentioned one afternoon while they loaded apple crates onto a truck. "Says you're teaching him to count in Japanese. His teacher thinks it's good for kids to learn about other places." Morrison had been sharing basic language lessons with Tommy during the boys' fence line visits, but hadn't realized the child was taking them seriously enough to mention at school. The image of Wisconsin children learning to count in Japanese while their fathers served in Pacific occupation forces struck Morrison as emblematic of the complex new world emerging from the war's ashes. That evening, Dr. Chen invited Morrison to join her for what she called their final consultation. And died over coffee in her office, real coffee, not the chicory substitute many Americans had consumed during wartime rationing. She shared observations that would stay with Morrison for the rest of his life. "I've been thinking about what happens next," she said. "For all of us. You'll return to a Japan that's been transformed by defeat and occupation. I'll transfer to a civilian hospital where I'll treat former enemies and former allies with equal care. The question is what we've learned from this experience." She showed him a letter she'd received that morning, word that her nephew David had been found alive in a Japanese prisoner camp, severely malnourished but expected to recover fully. The relief in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was something else, a kind of complicated gratitude that seemed to encompass more than just her nephew's survival. "He'll come home carrying his own stories about Japanese guards and doctors, just as you'll return with stories about American treatment. I hope both of you remember that individual kindness matters more than policy frameworks, that choosing humanity is always possible, even within systems designed for conflict." The final twist came during Morrison's last week at Camp McCoy, when Mrs. Hoffman, the Red Cross inspector, returned for a follow-up evaluation. This time, she requested private interviews with prisoners about their long-term treatment and their perspectives on repatriation. Sitting across from her in the same room where he'd given carefully neutral testimony months earlier, Morrison faced a choice that would define how he carried this experience forward. "Mrs. Hoffman's questions were direct. Had prisoners received adequate medical care? Had food been sufficient and nutritionally appropriate? Had guards maintained professional conduct throughout their captivity? Morrison could have answered with simple affirmatives, providing the bureaucratic confirmation that military authorities preferred. Instead, he found himself telling the complete truth about Dr. Chen's exceptional medical attention, about Brennan's hamburger lessons, about Tommy's innocent gifts of Coca-Cola and comic books, about the revelation that his treatment had been both strategically calculated and genuinely humane. "What will you tell your family about this experience?" Mrs. Hoffman asked finally. "Everything," Morrison replied. "The complexity of it, how enemies can be kind without being weak, how policy can serve strategic interests while still enabling individual mercy. They deserve to understand the world as it actually is, not as we were taught to imagine it." Mrs. Hoffman made detailed notes, her expression suggesting she understood the significance of Morrison's testimony. These records would become part of the historical documentation of prisoner treatment during the Pacific War, evidence that international law could be honored even during conflicts characterized by exceptional racial and cultural animosity. On his final evening at Camp McCoy, Morrison stood at the fence where Tommy Kowalski had first offered him a hamburger 8 months earlier. The boy was there again, now 9 years old and taller, carrying a farewell gift, a bottle of Coca-Cola and a photograph of himself with his family. "So you won't forget us," Tommy explained with the seriousness that children brought to important moments. Morrison accepted both gifts, understanding that he was receiving more than simple mementos. The photograph would remind him that Americans were individuals with families and stories, not the faceless enemies of wartime propaganda. The Coca-Cola would always carry the taste of abundance shared freely, of a nation confident enough in its values to treat prisoners better than survival required. The train that carried Morrison and his fellow prisoners toward the West Coast departed Camp McCoy at dawn, reversing the journey that had brought them to Wisconsin the previous winter. Watching the familiar farmland disappear behind them, Morrison felt the weight of testimonies he would carry home, not just his own experiences, but the responsibility of speaking truthfully about the capacity for humanity even within systems designed for war. Tanaka sat across from him, still wrestling with the same contradictions that had defined their captivity. "When they ask us about American camps, what will serve our nation better, confirming their cruelty or admitting their mercy?" Morrison considered the question while the train carried them toward an uncertain future in an occupied homeland. He thought of Dr. Chen treating enemy prisoners with the same care she hoped someone would show her nephew, of Brennan sharing cooking techniques because food was how he expressed friendship, of Tommy offering Coca-Cola because children understood kindness better than adults understood strategy. "Maybe what serves our nation best," Morrison said finally, "is learning that mercy isn't weakness, that treating enemies with humanity doesn't require abandoning strength. Maybe that's the lesson worth carrying home." The train whistle echoed across the Wisconsin countryside, carrying former prisoners toward repatriation and the challenge of explaining complex truths to people who needed simple stories. But Morrison had learned that the most important battles were often fought quietly, in kitchens where enemies shared recipes, in medical tents where healing transcended nationality, and in the hearts of individuals who chose kindness over cruelty, even when no regulations required it. Years later, Morrison would return to Wisconsin as part of a cultural exchange program, visiting the site where Camp McCoy had operated during the war. The buildings were long gone, converted to other purposes or demolished entirely, but he would find Tommy Kowalski, now a middle-aged teacher himself, still living in the same town and still believing that understanding between former enemies was not only possible, but essential. Over hamburgers and Coca-Cola, the same simple meal that had bridged their differences decades earlier, Morrison and Tommy would share memories of a time when the world had been simpler in its hatreds and more complex in its humanities. And Morrison would understand finally that the small acts of kindness he'd witnessed and received had indeed been strategic, but not in the way military planners had intended. They had been strategic in building a future where former enemies could sit together as friends, sharing food and stories, and the recognition that mercy, once experienced, becomes impossible to forget. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.